I'm Vernon Bingham. I was born in 1919 in Utah. Lived most of my life in Salt Lake City and joined the service in March of 1942. I was in Salt Lake and we immediately knew that there was going to be war. I just had a new car, and so my mother and father and my brother all went on down on the West Coast to have a trip and see the West Coast before we come back to join the service. My brother wasn't quite ready. He was still in his last year of high school, but I had had two and a half years of college, and I knew that I was primed to go, and so we took that trip together with our parents. We saw how busy the West Coast was. There was convoys of military trucks on the road everywhere we drove. But they did think that they might get some firing or bombs lobbed in from submarines, was their main thing. And they blacked out the West Coast. I joined the Air Force and went into the aviation cadet program. Well, I decided that I was certainly going to be a part of the war, and that's the one that I was interested in. I'd looked at, while I was on the West Coast, I'd looked at the new bombers, mostly the 17 at that time, B-17. And then they sent me off to flying school in Calero, Ontario, California. I immediately went into pilot training, and I had had to take off my glasses to pass their tests. And actually I had stigmatism, and I couldn't wear my glasses while I was in service, so I had about 32 hours of flight time, which is half of the primary course. And I went to land on an auxiliary field and landed too high and flipped over and was upside down. My instructor flew down immediately and checked to see if I'd turned off the engine, and I had, so he decided not to wash me out at that point, and sent me back for eye tests. And surprisingly, my eyes showed a little weak, but not too bad in the test, so they gave me 2 weeks leave and said to come back and hit the next class, which I did. And of course I wore my glasses, came back, passed their test, and went on to finish primary. However, then it was about the same length of time when I was assigned to go to basic training, I did not pass the eye test. And so at that point they sent me back to Santa Ana, and I went through the things again, and this time they decided that I could be a navigator, and was sent off to navigation school at Hondo, Texas. Well, navigational school was a much different thing. A lot of math, and a lot of discipline, not near as glamorous as the pilot side. But they started out with ground school, and after ground school then you went to flight school. And in flight school we would have to follow the pilot type navigation and sit in the back of the airplane with the windows blocked out so you couldn't see out. And then you'd have to follow where the pilot was taking you, and after an hour or so, why, then you had to give him directions back to the field. I think that practically all the navigators that got through navigation school ended up being good navigators. They washed them out if they didn't. Well, I think navigators was very important because they did, as you say, find the way to the target, and then of course have to get you home. Most people think the job of the navigator, his main job is to find the target. Well, that's important, and he has to find the target, but the more important thing is to, when you get a big mass of airplanes, is bringing all the groups in and not running away and leaving them or turning too sharp and kicking part of them out from not being able to keep airspeed up. We had other duties. For example, when we were flying over to southern Europe, if a fighter plane was in your escort and they actually had to do battle, they wouldn't have enough fuel to get home. And so they would radio into us, and a navigator from one group and a navigator from another group separated. We would do a fix on him, tell him where he was, tell him which way to fly so far, and then bail out. Usually, in my case, that was somewhere over Yugoslavia. Then you go to phase training, which is put you with your crew. And I did about 3 months of that off the California coast. And we flew practice bombing runs to Tonopah, Nevada. We also flew patrol off the west over the ocean. I was stationed at Salinas, and we flew the trips over the ocean because the thing that I said before, the fear of subs, Japanese subs. Now, I don't think we could have done much about it. They just wanted them, in case they had radar, to know we were there, because all we had in our B-24s were 100-pound practice bombs and about 5 or 6 rounds of ammunition, which is enough to pull the trigger once on a gun. And we lost quite a few planes at that. They were the early models of the 24, and things would go wrong with them. They'd lose their electrical system, for example, or something of that sort. Most of the planes that had real problems that I was experienced with were the first ones off of Willow Run at Ford. They were the B-24s, but they weren't the consolidated B-24. The Willow Run at Ford was for B-24s, and they probably put out more B-24s than anybody else.
My goodness.
In fact, they did some improvements on it, such as like a wheel housing. They made them in one, instead of bolting them together like the original consolidated was. Why they made it a casting that was one piece, which made the plane lighter, and when we got to combat, those planes were about 10 miles an hour faster than the others. Well, the only place that's spacious is where you put the bombs. The rest of the plane is rather crowded. It's, in fact, the bombardier and navigator have to negotiate a little tunnel around where the nose wheel goes to get up in their compartment. And of course, you can't stay there for either takeoff or landing, because if the wheels give way or anything, why, that's the part of the plane that gets chewed up. So you have to crawl into there after the plane's in the air, and then of course get out of there before the landing. I had a little wooden desk that folds down so that in fact I normally while working I would be my back to the front of the plane, and my back to the bombardier's back, and he was over at the bomb site. I went overseas in August of '44, and I was a replacement crew. We had pink airplane. It was a whole squadron was going, but we flew singly. But we flew from up the north route, which is from Bangor, Maine to Presque Isle, Maine, to Gander Lake, Newfoundland. From Gander Lake, Newfoundland, we flew to Nuts Corner, Ireland. That's just outside Belfast. We crossed the ocean at night on the first leg and used stars. Actually, we could get, as we come into England, we could get the beam, but and the pilots thought that was great, and we wouldn't let them follow them because the Germans could turn the beam. In fact, they had turned the beam so that planes would go into the North Sea and run out of fuel. And we made a believer out of our pilot on that because I told him to clock the beam and see where his headings would be. And they were so much different than the headings that I had that he figured out quickly that it would take him to the North Sea. As I understand, we lost a lot of fighter planes that tried to follow the beam. So they had to revert to the Navigators, getting them across. Then we flew down the English Channel to Land's End, and from Land's End we flew what you call a landfall. That is, we flew in the daytime, and we used the sun because the only celestial body you have in the daytime, and we flew on about a 45-degree angle west from Land's End. And then straight south by noon. We were still had our good sun shots then at noon, and flew south, straight south for a couple hours. Then we did a landfall going 45 degrees as the sun was setting into Marrakesh, French Morocco. Our first base was at Benghazi, Libya. And we were part of the 9th Air Force, which was under the British command, under the British 8th Army. And so we flew support for a lot of their endeavors, as well as for the invasions of southern Italy and Sicily. My next base was Sousse, which is in South Tunisia. We did that after the Americans had cleared that area coming through North Africa. B-24s put more tonnage in World War II than any other airplane. They were the mass-produced plane. There was a lot more of them than there was 17s. We had 17s flying out of the same groups. But we didn't fly together because their speeds are just a little bit different. They used 17s more out of England on shorter flights, and the B-24 could take the longer ones and carry a little more tonnage. I went in as a replacement for the Ploesti raid. The first Ploesti raid, my group was a part of it. They lost about a third of their planes, or a little bit more. In fact, my squadron that we went to as a replacement, practically everybody in it was replacement because most of them had gone down. Well, it's in the eastern edge of Romania, and from North Africa, it's a whale of a long ways. It's about a 20-hour mission. We didn't lose near as many planes because we flew at high altitude. And we had enough planes by then that they didn't worry about them not knowing you were coming. They always knew you were coming. In fact, when you went over Ploesti at high altitude, there were 3 Ploestis. One was a real one and 2 were fakes. So the Navigator and the Bombardier had to be real sure what they were doing. And they had also put smoke pots out everywhere to try to cover them in smoke. But we could usually figure out the right ones. We knew it well. Once you dropped the bombs, you knew, because if you hit it, it looked like the flames was going to engulf you before you could get out of there. But the whole area below you would explode. I think the main thing that crippled the German effort was the oil, because Ploesti was about half of their oil supply. And every time you'd knock it out, why, you just knocked them out into that big of a problem. They would repair it awful fast, but we'd go get it again. In fact, our colonel was a Colonel Kane. They called him Killer Kane. He was one of the first men to get the Congressional Medal of Honor for the Air Force. With Colonel Kane, it was a real experience because Colonel Kane was a colonel of his own making. He was swashbustling, I guess you'd call it. He did things his way. And in those early days of the flying, this was all ahead of D-Day, you know. I was back in the United States for D-Day. But Colonel Kane, having the Congressional Medal of Honor, could do about as he pleased with his groupings. He could get by with most anything. But he didn't ever want to have a mission that he wouldn't lead himself. In our grouping, the missions were, requirement was 50 missions before you returned to the U.S. In my case, I flew the extra 2 because I'd been taken off from my crew as a lead navigator with this Colonel Kane once and with a Colonel Gray another time, our later commander, and flown separate from my crew. And so I came back to my crew and to finish out their missions. It took 2 extra for me. My wing had 2 B-24 groups and 2 17 groups. And that's all that we flew it for some time. And by the time that I was through my missions, which was just about 6 months later, I led a couple of flights of almost 500 airplanes. I led the big groups like that about 2 times, and then before they grew to that big, I led several times. But I was a lead flight leader and lead navigator for about the last third of my missions. This is a navigation case, Dead Reckoning Type A4 case, and every Air Force navigator had one of these. It was issued to them. By the way, one of the other things that would go in this is a navigator's computer. This is a computer that a navigator uses you use a drift meter. A drift meter is simply a tube that you can look through. It goes down to the bottom of the airplane, and you can see how you're drifting over the landscape. And so you can figure out wind from that. You actually plot your wind direction and on this by using a pencil on it. You can plot in your wind direction and wind speed, and that of course affects your airspeed and the direction you're going. If you have a heading, why the wind's blowing you off of it, so you have to correct for that. In other words, you have to crab into the wind to keep your true course. And this is the device that you use to figure that out. And we carried all of our books and navigation equipment in it, and so it was ready to go at any time. In here, as for example, is lots of maps. We also I have no charts in here, but we used to fly off of a chart. Actually, we'd put in our own coordinates, and we didn't very often use the maps because we didn't very often do pilotage. Mostly we used the stars or a combination of coastline and radio compass. But this, for example, is an astronomical navigation tables. That's what you have to use to figure out the timing on the sun, and they're by latitudes all over the world, and you have to have the one that's the correct latitude that you're flying in, and it's matched with Greenwich Mean Time to come up with the right answers for where the stars are. These are different things about your airplane that a navigator should know. This is the American Air Almanac, and we have to match that with this other book and get the times for different shots for different stars. And then, of course, we carried our logs in here. This is the type of log that we used in combat. These are actual logs from my missions. I don't have them all because whenever you're a leader, all of those are turned into headquarters and you never see them again. But the ones where you're following or just leading a flight, we could get those back. This one here is this is a copy of my last flight. And the reason I have a copy is because Blackie, this fellow other navigator that I found later, it was a prisoner of war, he went down and he was hit over southern Austria, but they were able to get down below the clouds to came off of the Alps, and came down and went over to got to Yugoslavia before they had to bail out. And when they bailed out, the Germans, of course, picked him up. But meantime, the townspeople had caught him first, and those same townspeople had a reunion a year ago where they wanted to put a monument to that crew up in their little town. And so he didn't, because he was a prisoner of war, he didn't have any of his own logs, and they'd like to have a log. So he thought maybe I had a log of that mission, which I didn't. But I did have this last log that I had, and he asked if I'd send a copy, and I sent him a copy, and so he took it over to Yugoslavia last year, and as I understand it, it's in some kind of a monument or something that they have to that crew and that airplane. They have parts of the airplane there too. These things are here. They came in a waterproof case like this. It's through the years it's come apart, but we carried this in our flight suit pocket. I carried mine, had a knee pocket right there, and carried it. But it included these maps. They're silk, but they covered all the areas where we flew. You can see Italy there, and another part of the rest of Italy, and Sicily. This is France, and we had all the area from the Balkans right on up into Central Europe in those maps. And also had a compass. Of course, map don't mean much unless you got a compass, so we had a compass. And then we had money in there to bribe the peasants or whoever might have found you. And these, at first, in the first part of my missions, it carried monies from paper money from all of the areas that we were flying over. But then they found out that the Blue Seal dollar bill meant more to those people than any of their own money. And so from then on we carried, I think we had almost $50 worth of Blue Seal money in those packets. Blue Seal is the only money U.S. money that's backed by silver certificates. They are silver certificates. They're backed by silver. If you're shot down, it would do wonders. The British had a real good underground system all through southern Europe, and they would pick them up and bring them back to an island of Vis on the west coast of Yugoslavia, where a motor launch went there every night and picked them up and brought them back. Some of the flyers would be back the next day. We used to go up the Adriatic when we was in Africa. We'd try to stay over the water whenever we could. So going up to a target, we go up to that, and Axis Sally, who you've heard of, was on a railroad flat car, I guess, or at least a railroad car, on a railroad that goes about the full length of the Balkans from north to south. And they would move it every night and put it in a different place every day, so you couldn't find it where it was to bomb it. But what they never figured out is America's navigators, because what we did, when we'd start out a mission, she would be on the radio telling you what happened to all your buddies yesterday and that type of thing. But we'd turn on our radio compass, and we'd take a bearing on her to our plane where we were at the time, and then we'd fly an hour or two and take another bearing. By the time before we got the target, we knew where she was. And actually, we could use that on our way home, or if we got in trouble, because we could then tune our radio to Axis Sally, which was always playing nice music, American tunes. And we could use that as a way to help the fighters to where they ought to land, and that to check our own information. We could always cross it with that Adriatic coastline and figure out exactly where that car was that day. And to my knowledge, they never moved it in the daytime. They moved it every night. We could usually stay right on course all the way to target, because we flew high. We weren't above the clouds like the jets do today, but we were above a lot of the clouds in the storm. And we could usually, the biggest problem would be is if you got to target and it was overcast, because we couldn't see through the clouds. The one mission when I flew separate from my crew with Colonel Kane as a lead navigator, we flew to Crete to bomb the pig pens. You know, pig pens are for the place where they keep the submarines. And they were usually very strict on following all your regulations, but we came over and over the target, and Colonel Kane comes on the intercom and says, "How's the ack-ack? Light or heavy?" Heavy ack-ack can go to 20,000 and above, and light is around 10. And so the gunners reported back that it was light. So he come on the intercom to me and says, "Make a 180 and come over at 10,000. We had been coming at 20. And so he was the colonel, and that's what we did. We came over at 180, and of course we hit the target very well. And then as we started home, he said, "Have you ever flown a grid?" And I said, "Yeah, in training I flew grids." He says, "I want you to fly a grid from the east end of Crete to the west end." And I said, "Okay." And so I flew the grid, which was just back and forth across. We come to the sea on one end, turn, go to the sea on the other, and about 10 miles apart. And after we got through with that, why, we flew back to our base in Benghazi, and I kept quizzing some of the senior officers as to why he had me do that. Well, the first thing I run into is when I turned in my log, I put us at about an hour and a half beyond when I was my return time. And the intelligence officer said, "You didn't do that." And I says, "Well, yes, I did." And he says, "No, you've got to make me another log that says you didn't because you're not supposed to." So I had to make up another log, put it as though I flew straight home. Well, it took me a long time to find out what happened on it, what it was, but it seems in the past the Germans had bombed Benghazi at the same time that Colonel Kane was trying to bring his bombers in from a bombing mission, and they were interrupting his ability to land. Colonel Kane spoke German, and he got on the intercom and found their channel and told them if they didn't get the hell out of there, that he was going to find their rest homes on the Isle of Crete, and he's going to blow them to smithereens. And so we decided that what we were doing is we were searching for those. And finally one time, one senior officer told me, he says, "What you didn't know is the last 3 planes in your formation still had their bombs, and if he'd have found it, he'd have bombed them." In combat, that concentration is good. It's a lot better to be concentrating than to be thinking about what's happening. We were very focused on what we were going to get done. The attitude was that you didn't, of course, you didn't know whether you was going to come back or if you was going to get hit or what would happen to you. But I kind of made one decision, and that was that if I got back, that after being through what I was through, wasn't anything was ever going to scare me again, and I don't think anything has. Bombardier and Navigator are in the nose of the plane, and it's all plexiglass all around you. You can see everything real well. In our plane, a lot of them later ones had turrets, but ours did not. We had 2 guns, one on each side, and 50 caliber machine guns. And the Navigator manned one over target, and the Bombardier manned the other one. The guns that could shoot down the fighters were our turrets. We had a top turret and a bottom turret and a rear turret, and they were all, the sights were made so that it wasn't line of sight, it was calibrated, and they could hit them. The other guns, while the wingmen, or the men in the rear of the plane, the crewmen, had guns on the sides of the planes, and they sometimes hit them, but our real force was our turrets. The rest of us, you throw out tracers, and that affects what fighters do, and that's the main thing that you could do with it. You couldn't really claim a kill. They'd like to come in from out of the sun, so you couldn't see them, whichever side that happened to be from. Usually over target. You wouldn't be bothered with fighters until you got over target. Then you'd get anti-aircraft, and if anti-aircraft crippled you, any crippled plane that couldn't keep up the formation, the fighters picked them off. Very seldom did they go beyond that. The other things that they would go for is sometimes a flight would turn too sharply over target, and the outside planes couldn't keep up, and they'd pick those off. Or if you did turn too sharply, well, the inside of your flight, if there's a lot of planes, they'd stall out and maybe drop 7,000 or 8,000 feet before they could straighten out. Usually the fighters would get those. And you'd think that those things wouldn't happen, but in combat they did happen. I mean, you had several groups coming in from different sides on a target, and you'd have to turn sharper than you wanted to, and things of that sort. But that's what the German fighters did, is they picked off a cripple of any kind. Well, for example, an 88 millimeter bullet took out about 4 cylinders of one of our engines one time and never blew up. That comes back to what I've always said is that if the Germans had had a proximity fuse on their 88 millimeter like we had on our 90, we might not have won the war, because theirs went off on time and they had to time it for a given altitude, and we of course had this aluminum foil that we could throw out to louse that up, and so we had lots of 88 millimeter stuff go through our planes, go through wings, go through the fuselage, and like I say, could even go through an engine without exploding. We were always based on a former German base, and we had in fighter planes and in bombers, they put about a 1/4-inch steel plate in the back of the seat to protect the occupant. But of course, in the nose of the plane, we had nothing like that. So we would scrounge around to the old German planes and take it off the back of their seat, and then we could put that down in the bottom of where we stood and where the bombardier kneeled, and you'd be surprised how the two of us could end up completely protected by that one little piece of steel. When we moved into southern Italy, it was humid, and it was a new experience for us because we would get to altitude, and of course at altitude is probably 50 below, and it would freeze up the track for that our bomb bay doors ran on, and so we'd have to drop our bombs right through them. Of course, the bombs are heavy enough; they'd go through them. But then the track was broken, and you couldn't get them back up to keep out the cold air at all. So it was quite a program. We sometimes watched the plane next to us trying to get theirs back up, and see wires going down in hands and trying the whole way home, and still maybe wouldn't make it. We had electric suits to plug in. The only problem with electric suits is you'd usually end up with burn spots. In other words, while your fingers were freezing, while your elbow was burning. So sometimes, in fact, we were always started out under the British, and so if we were able to get hold of a British heated suit, that's what we took, because it had more circuits than ours. You could turn, if it's got that problem, you could turn off one circuit and still keep warm. On my plane, I was the oxygen officer, and very often we'd get our oxygen, our supply, the pipe supply, going to each station, get that kicked out, and we had auxiliary supply oxygen bottles to use in that case. But if you had quite a long mission, you'd have to ration it, and so in effect I was a ration officer, and you'd of course keep a bottle on your pilot all the time, and your co-pilot once in a while. When I'd come to the bombardier, I'd just give him enough to keep him with us, because we practically always bombed in the middle of the day. Weather was your biggest problem. If it was a target that a dispersed target, we'd drop our bombs just on ETA. If it was a more unique target, or a target like a railroad or something, we'd take our bombs back home. The smartest part of our bomb was our bomb site, our Norden bomb site. Well, the bombardier had to be very skilled. His coordination of his fingers and his eyes had to be tremendous. In fact, that's how they choose bombardiers. And most of them were good. The things that would throw you off would be weather and other fighters and anti-aircraft hitting you at the same time, things of that type. We did not get over Germany too much, but we did get to Austria, and we used to go to near Venice at Wiener Neustadt quite often because that was a fighter plane factory. And then we went all through the Balkans and Brasov up in Romania, all the oil fields. Approximately 10 hours, sometimes 12, longest 14. We did not lose any crewmen, and in fact we never lost our plane. Our plane returned from every mission that we flew it, and we had to crash land a couple of times, but it was always fixable. We bombed marshalling yards. When we went to this mission, it was very unusual because they had never hit it. We were able to do pretty well. We had done a lot of railroad bombing because we bombed Brenner Pass. We were bombing Brenner Pass because that's where the munitions went down for Anzio. And that was probably one of our tougher missions because we had to go follow the railroad tracks, the only way that we could get our bombs in because the mountains were so high on each side. We had to go parallel to the tracks. And of course, when we went parallel to the tracks, why the Germans had all their anti-aircraft on flat cars sitting down there on those tracks you were following. We got hit over target, lost 2 engines, and a part of our tail, a rudder. So we could only turn in one direction. Actually, the pilot said we should bail out and ordered to bail out. And I told him that we could get into Naples because it wasn't very far. And he said, well, we're losing altitude awful fast. I said, well, we'll still make it. So he said, okay, and that's what we did. We got into Naples. I earned my DFC on that mission for the fact that I countered the pilot and got the plane in. The DFC is a Distinguished Flying Cross, and on all our missions you get the Air Medal. In our missions we would get an Air Medal usually every 5 missions, so I have about 9 of them. But the DFC is for distinguished flying, and mostly it goes to pilots who bring in a plane that's been riddled or bombed or hurt so badly that it can't hardly get in, or something of that sort, or they lead a flight that loses an awful lot and still gets them home, something of that sort. In fact, navigators don't very often get it. My crew wrote it up. I assume mostly my bombardier. I was only doing what in my own best good as well as my crew's to get the plane in. I just felt that we could get it back and did. But our plane was bad enough that took about 2 weeks. So we had 2 weeks off in Naples and the Isle of Capri. A very tight-knit group, but 2 groups, the 4 officers and the 6 enlisted men. I might give you a story on that. When we landed at Naples, it was, of course, late, and it was past the time when the mess was open. And so somebody told us that we could, if we went downtown into Naples, we could feed our group and the crew and everything, and then we could come back, and they arranged for a truck to take us down. We got to Naples, and the driver let us out of the truck, and we had to walk a block or 2 to get to this Red Cross place to get something to eat. And while we were doing this, we got picked up by the MPs because we were fraternizing with our enlisted men. Well, what happened there is our pilot demanded that they was going to take us. They took us into the headquarters, and we didn't know whether they was going to throw us in the brig or what they were going to do. But anyway, he demanded a phone call to his commander. He called back and got Colonel Kane, and Colonel Kane said, "What's the highest ranking officer you got there?" And they told him, and it was a colonel. They brought the colonel in, and he looked to us like he was standing at attention and saluting while Colonel Kane was having at him. And they says, "Forget it, you guys can go." He was really a nice little fellow that protected our tents on the days that we flew, so that the other Italians couldn't steal from us. And he thought so much of us that one day when we came home from a mission, why our water supply had been changed over to a wine supply. And when we got to thinking and asking around about it, he brought his dad down, and his dad told us that he had one of the better jobs in Italy. He was an engineer for the railroad, but that his son made more off the cigarettes we gave him than he ever made as being an engineer. Anzio was so critical, and we were just about to lose it. And so the Germans were stockpiling ammunition and everything on the railroad and putting it there so that figured that nobody'd go after them there, and they hadn't up till this time. But this was just after the bombing of Cassino, and we'd bombed there. In fact, all the light bombers and heavy bombers and fighters had hit that one day on about 15-minute intervals, and we still couldn't knock it out. And so that's the background to this. Then when they decided that they was going to have to hit them here because we were just about to lose Anzio. And in fact, the order came out as something we had never seen before, and that was that if there was any Catholic crew who chose not to fly, did not have to. I might say that it didn't affect us very much. My pilot and co-pilot were both Catholic, and we flew. But I think that it was a good mission, and that we did bomb it out. And we didn't hit the Vatican, nor we didn't hit Rome. This was just ahead of D-Day. And up until that point, crews, when they got their 52 missions, went home to stay, come back to States to be training fields or something else. We were the first group that didn't. They sent us home on a 30-day leave, signed us to our home station, which in my case was Salt Lake City, and I was attached to Hill Air Force Base, and I had 30 days of leave, and they had me. I was to get in touch with the war bonds salesman for the state, which I did, which in my case was quite enjoyable because he was the attorney for the company that I worked for before I went into service. But I give a few speeches helping them sell war bonds while I was home. And so we had to be all assembled back to go back overseas. And mostly some of our enlisted men were somewhat disgruntled about being the first to have to go back. And so by the time we got back, some of them had been in trouble with the law in a lot of places. But anyway, we got them all reassembled, and they put us on a ship that was a former cruise ship, and it still had the cruise ship captain. They put on a bunch of prisoners of war that that was civilian prisoners of war, that by joining the service they could become, when they finished their combat, they would be free. And they were something to handle too. And so as we got our assignments as officers in the Air Force, we had different assignments with a group of our men to do different jobs on the ship. My particular job was to wash down the decks, and I had a crew of about 8 enlisted men to do that. But I would run into these prisoners the first day while they were sitting in a circle playing cards, and I'd hear them saying things like, "I think we ought to throw the lieutenant overboard," and things like that. And I told them they'd have to get below deck because we was going to clean the deck, and of course they wouldn't go. So I went to our lieutenant colonel, who was the commander of our group, and said to him what was the problem was and what he wanted me to do. And he says, "Well, I'll come up and we'll see." And so he came up and took over the hose and then proceeded to turn it and wash the guys off the deck out into the ocean. And then he ordered us to throw over life preservers, which we did, and they were able to get on the life preservers and get back on the ship. But needless to say, when I asked them to go below in the following days, they all hurried and scrambled to get below. We were a part of a convoy, and the convoy commander, when he heard about the incident, he relieved the civilian Navy captain of his duty and put our lieutenant colonel in charge of the ship. So he was in charge of the ship the rest of the way over to Iran, North Africa. They put us in a replacement depot in southern Italy. We stayed there about a month and a half, and they decided to send us all home again. I came back from combat and went to a combat I&E school, Information Education School, Lexington, Virginia. And then I reassigned combat returnees, officer combat returnees, to duty after interviewing them and doing that type of work, because they found that they did much better by having other combat returnees do it and make it work. And so I did that until when they come out with the point system, I had buku points, and so I got out as soon as I could, and that was in 1945. I went home and went back to my old job. I worked with my parents, and they had a tough time keeping the business going while the war was gone. I was gone, and so I just come back and took over. I met my wife just before I went overseas, I guess.
Before you went into service?
In fact, she was just a little girl, and my friend was dating her older sister, and I went up with him to see her. In fact, I remember I told my wife told her at the time that if she grew up while I was off in the service, I'd come back and give her a date. She had to remind me of that promise, but it worked out. My 98th bomb group that I was a part of is still an active bomb group, and they have an organization of the 98th bomb group, and it's held every year. And one year when it was held down in Colorado Springs, we went to it, and were surprised that one of the fellows we met there, a navigator, because he was the navigator that was our wingman when we was coming back from Augsburg, Germany, a mission to Augsburg, and we watched him get shot down. And that's the last we'd ever heard of him, until I went to this reunion, and there he was. He said as he landed, as fast as they landed, why the Germans were there to grab him, and they went to Stalag 2, I think, but Stalag 3, and they weren't treated too well, and some of them. I've never been back, no.
Have you ever wanted to go back?
Oh, at times it seemed like it might be interesting, and some other times it seems like you don't want to revisit it. They had an air show over in Salt Lake, and my wife's brother, he went through the Navy program and became a Navy pilot, and then he flew missions during the Korean War off the China Seas, and he also went into politics and became mayor of Salt Lake. They had an old B-24 that he was going to fly, and so of course he convinced her first that I should be over there. And so I went over and flew in the Navigator seat one day. It didn't seem like that plane was near as big as when I used to fly it. Well, he said that he couldn't figure out how the pilots were able to muscle that thing around for 12, 14 hours and still be able to do anything, because it took so much out of you to do it. It's a pretty cumbersome airplane.
What kind of memories does that bring back to you?
Well, the color brings back the deserts in North Africa. If you can see the bulkhead in there, there was a desk that dropped down. And I sit at the desk and in the bomb sight like this, and the bombardier's on his knees at the bomb site. Later, some of my missions, they had a turret on the front. And in those, the navigator couldn't hardly see anything. The pilots really like to get in the lead, get to be lead, because, navigators did too, but pilots liked it because then the navigator would take over the automatic pilot, and he just controlled the speed and kept the formation going right. Tail end Charlies were the tough places to fly.
Oh, yeah. You had to put on so much power to catch up and then pull it clear back. And every time they changed.
In the air that I was flying, the first mission, the tail enders would get very apt to get shot down, because these are boxcars to hold bombs. It looks a lot bigger here without the bomb bays. The bomb bay trail you walk between is about 8 inches wide. In a bomber, this is the widest part of it right here for moving around, because the bomb bay doors are up there in that wide part. Four officers and 6 enlisted men. Well, the instruments in the cockpit is all the same.
Well, they've done some changes to these too.
This pedestal is not the same.
And she's still going good.
Yeah.
Those are Pratt Whitney engines. Pratt and Whitney's, yes sir, 1830s.
I always say if there's 15 people standing there around you, there'll be 21 different opinions.
You're clear.
That old gentleman up there in the cockpit,
I bet.
that old man's got tears in his eyes.
This is bigger than you thought it was.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a real boxcar.
Look at this. It's a 110-foot wing.
Oh, yeah.
There's no tail turret. There's no ball turret. There's no upper turret.
Yeah. I did see one up
And there
front.
was no See, the ones they flew in combat, they were B-24Js, H's and J's. This was a B-24D or E. See, we'd have to, for us to get up there, we'd have to open the bomb bays, cool it down, get underneath the bomb door, they'd crawl up on a catwalk and go in. If we wanted to get at the back door, because the height of it off the ground, we'd get up underneath the nose, right by the tail wheel, get underneath there and raise our back, and we put the thing back on the tail skid. That's where they got tail skid there. And that put the tail skid down, and you get in it, and you can climb it through.
She's the tour leader of her.
You could chin up on them, you know, they were just rock hard.
Hey, Floyd. Go to the side. I don't know what you're calling up. Oh, yeah. Well, the Bombardier sat here. The Navigator sat behind, but the Bombardier sat here. And you can see that's the wheel right up there from 1944 and 1945. I was an airplane commander, the 9th Bomb Group.
You don't look that old.
Well, I'm 80, so I'm old.
You sure don't look like it.
I've been lucky, I guess.
That bomb site, Tennessee Ernie Ford donated that to the Confederate Air Force.
Is that right?
He was a bombardier in World War II on these.
That's the tunnel.
Oh, that's
it's a
the one
tunnel
they-
that goes from the front can to the rear can.
Okay.
And
I
you
saw a
have to climb
picture of
through
that.
it. I couldn't climb through it now.
Oh, it's pretty good size. I don't think we get the tail gun anymore.
We can carry 40 500 pounders.
40.
40.
Double.
10. They're Wright R3350s. 2,200 horsepower engines. They were, big, powerful engines. But by the end of the war, they had all the problems worked out, and they just had perfect engines. The first 10 times I flew in a B-29, I only got back on the ground with all 4 engines running twice. That's not a very good percentage.
Our early problems with them was electrical.
Had a lot of electrical problems, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't, I don't remember many
They
electrical
probably
problems.
solved that in the B-24.
Yeah, because we didn't have electrical
But
problems.
that's out over the Pacific. That's the way we lost them, was electrical.
Ours
We
were
flying
engines.
once, and we lost all 4 engines at once. But we were about 20,000, so by the time we got down to 10, we had them.
Had them running again.
Had them running again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we didn't have electrical problems. We just had engine problems. We started out with a 20 millimeter in the tail. But, you couldn't carry enough ammunition, it doesn't fire very fast, and 250 calibers would do just as much damage to a Jap fighter as a 20 millimeter would. I mean, they'd knock them down just as fast. These are gun sights,
Yeah.
remote control gun sights.
Are they remote control?
Yeah, they're remote control gun sights. See, there's a turret,
Where's the gunner?
and up there's a turret, and the gunner sits right there. And then on top you had a turret, and then up front you had a 4-gun turret. And these are all remote control. And the
boy,
guy
that
up
would've
there
been
in the
great.
center, he could switch them around. Wherever the
Where he
fighters
wanted
were
the
coming
fighters.
from, he could throw the guns to that side. And these were the first remote control ones. And they had a thing, and then they'd get them on the wingtips, push the buttons, and then
Well, that's something that we didn't have.
Yeah.
Our top turrets worked good. Our bottom turret worked good. Tail turret worked good. I mean, to hit a plane. But the guns, we had 2 guns on each side, and then 1 more in the nose, and we couldn't hit anything.
Okay.
I got started with the wrong foot. I got up to the top. Couldn't get my knee bent.
this is the radio operator's seat.
You want to sit there?
Yeah, that's where I'm used to sitting.
Oh, okay.
I sat there for about 1,000 hours.
We had one pilot, he was flying along and had a burst of flak. In combat, this airplane flew with a crew of 11. There were 6 up front and 5 in the rear. Pilot sat here, co-pilot here, bombardier sat down here. He's got a cushion underneath of this that he sits on, and it's not all that uncomfortable. He didn't have to sit on that wood or the bare metal or anything. Down below up front is the old Norden bomb site, very top secret in the first part of World War II. I guess after a while they had enough B-17s and B-24s that crashed in Germany that the Germans actually had the bomb site. But by that time they were more on the defensive than they were on the offensive.
My last 3 missions, I led flights of almost 500 airplanes.
Is that right? Yeah, I guess they're rumbling our cage, telling us they want us to get out. Yeah, these.
Step to the rear there.
Very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Yes, enjoyed it. Enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
just